So far, everything we've learned in this class was about the similarity we can see in all lives on Earth. We've learned about how chemical elements form molecules. We've looked at the important biomolecules that are used to build cells, as well as the basic components you can find in a cell, and also how cells generate and utilize energy, how life on Earth stores and passes genetic information, and then how they express this genetic information. So all of these are basically considered as the unity part of life, because regardless of what a cell is, be a bacteria, a leaf cell in a plant, or a brain cell in a human, the principle on how a cell functions is all the same. So that's the unity part. However, life is also highly diverse, and this diversity can make life exciting because it comes in many different forms. You can have anywhere from a single cellular bacteria to very complex plants and animals, which all look different, they act different, and they live in different regions of the world that offer very different environmental conditions. So, what enables lives to go from unity to diversity? Or we can ask the same question the other way around. With such diversity, why would lives in different forms share so many similar characteristics? And the answer is evolution, which is quite an amazing process, and it can explain why lives are so similar but also so different. So we are going to learn about evolution in this week's videos. Okay, so as of today, biologists have identified approximately 1.8 million species on Earth, which could be 20 or maybe 2% of all the species we estimate to have in our biosphere. So there's a lot more coming, right? And with this diversity, it's a great hallmark of life. Yet, as we just mentioned, as diverse as life is, it also displays remarkable unity. For example, the cell structures of a single cellular protist are fundamentally the same to a cell in a multicellular human, right? Another example, from bacteria to mushrooms to a pine tree to a human, all of us use DNA to carry out our genetic information. And the reason behind the two seemingly contradicting sides about life, again, is evolution. So, what exactly is evolution? Well, according to Charles Darwin, who is, the scientist that came up with the concept of biological evolution, he explained evolution as descent with modifications. In other words, all life forms we see today are the modified descendants of common ancestors. So we can see in this figure here, which isn't entirely accurate, but it kind of portrays the right idea, right? That different forms of life really are the modified descendants of a common ancestor, which is down here. So this is our common, I was going to say common A, but that's our common ancestor. One concept to establish about evolution is that it's an ongoing process. It's not just an end result. So anything we observe in a species at any given moment just reflects one point throughout the evolutionary process for that group of those organisms. It might not be the same as before, and it probably won't be the same in the future. So in the process of evolution, it can be driven by different mechanisms. And the most commonly known mechanism that drives evolution forward is natural selection. And because of the nature of biology, anything can happen. So evolution can also be driven by chance in certain situations. Okay, so we'll get back to that part later, but for now, let's focus on evolution by natural selection. Okay, so evolution by natural selection is again a concept that was proposed by the famous Charles Darwin, as well as his compatriot Alfred Walrus. Oh my gosh. Alfred Wallace. I don't know why I couldn't say that. Anyways, both of these guys went on a voyage to the Galapagos, which are a geologically isolated island chain by South America. And they, Darwin was in the Galapagos and Wallace was in the Malaysian archipelagos. So both of these islands chains had fascinating species that weren't found anywhere else in the world. So after observing and collecting an impressive amount of special specimens, both of these guys, Darwin and Wallace, observed different species showing different traits that were suitable for their particular habitats, and also similar traits that indicated a common ancestry. And the two great minds independently came to the same conclusion and proposed the mechanism of natural selection for the evolution of new species. So here's an example of what Darwin found. On the Galapagos Island, he found many different finches that were never seen on the main continent. These finches looked very similar at first glance, but when you observe them a bit more carefully, they varied in their body sizes as well as their beak shapes. And when he analyzed it further, Darwin realized that the beak shapes happened to match the type of food that these different finches ate. So he concluded that these finches are the descendants of a common ancestor, probably a finch from the mainland. And in order to survive in the islands where they had limited resources, these finches descended with modification from their common ancestor, and the differences among their beaks allowed them to adapt to different environmental niches. By eating from different food sources, they all got to survive, right? So Darwin defined this observation of descent with modification as evolution, once again, which is just an idea stating that species would change over time to give rise to a new species. And he proposed natural selection to be the driving force of this process. So, what exactly is natural selection? Well, in Darwin's theory of evolution, natural selection is an inevitable outcome in nature. And this is because of three different principles that always happen in nature. The first one is characteristics are heritable. And that means that characteristics are passed from parents to offspring. So, for example, taller parents would give rise to tall kids, right? And short parents would usually give rise to short kids. The second principle here states that within a population, the offspring have to vary among each other in characteristics. So continuing from our early example, within a population, we see individuals with different heights, right? Some are tall, some are short. And then our third and last principle about how nature operates is that resources are always limited. And a population usually reproduces more individuals than the habitat can sustain. So that means that competition is inevitable. Individuals with different characteristics within a population have to compete against each other to survive. And whoever has the more favorable traits for that particular environment that they're living in has the higher chance to survive and therefore reproduce. Hence the saying, survival of the fittest, right? So that's how natural selection works. Nature would always pick out the fittest traits. And as a result, since the surviving individuals always pass the same traits to their offspring, this would eventually cause the trait to increase in frequency in this particular population over generations. So over time, the population would become more fit to their present environment, and this is what we call adaptation, right? So, for example, if a population contains individuals of various heights, again, some are tall, some are short, and we see tall parents that generally give birth to tall children, short parents giving birth to short children. Let's say the environment this population lives in has big monsters that will hunt humans, right? So the problem is that many of the hiding places are really tiny, and tall people would have a hard time squeezing themselves in, right? If they're in the bushes, their legs and their head are going to be sticking out. Therefore, they're going to tend to be captured and eaten by these monsters. So as a result, more short people are going to survive. And since the short people give birth to short children, over time, you're going to see the average height of this particular population is going to go down. People are going to get shorter over time because it's only the short people surviving, right? That's how natural selection and adaptation work as well. So, in conclusion, evolution is the change of characteristics in a population over time. And natural selection is the mechanism that drives evolution. So, here's some key points to keep in mind about natural selection. First, there's no better traits, only the fitter traits. So, because natural selection depends on the particular environment that the population lives in, it doesn't mean that it's always a better trait, but a trait that's suitable for environment A might not necessarily be suitable for environment B. And a trait that's suitable for A at this moment might not be suitable for the same environment in 500 years, right? The second one is that natural selection can only act on existing heritable variations. So it can only pick out the fitter trait when there are already several different traits for it to pick from. So this existing heritable variation of a given character comes from all the different alleles of a specific gene in the population. And we call this gene pool, the gene pool of a population, right? And then lastly, last key point is that heritable variation come from random mutations as well as sexual reproduction. So both of those kind of introduce diversity essentially into the population. Okay, so let's dive in to understand evolution a bit more by looking at the evidence that supports it. Here's some important points to kind of keep in mind about evolution. And first, it's that population is the smallest unit of evolution. Individuals do not evolve, they just present different characteristics for natural selection to work on. So, again, whoever presents the fittest trait will survive and they get to reproduce more. So, over time, the population composition will change to have more of that fitter trait. Therefore, evolution can also be defined as the generation to generation change in a population. Okay. So next, again, we've kind of mentioned this, natural selection can only work on heritable traits. So only traits that are encoded by genes and can be passed on to the next generation that can possibly affect the reproductive success of that generation. So learned behaviors aren't necessarily passed down, right? And lastly, and probably the most important concept that you need to establish about evolution is that evolution doesn't have a goal. A population doesn't evolve to be stronger, better, or smarter because the environments are always changing. You never know what you're going to get. Natural selection can't anticipate what an organism will need in the future. So just like we said earlier, a trait that is the fittest for a particular environment right now might not be the same fit for that area in 500 years. Evolution only happens in response to the local environmental condition at that time. And evolution does occur over long periods of time, but that doesn't mean that things can't change over time, right? And when we're talking about time and the scale of evolution, it's not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. It's not even 100 years. Usually it is 500 plus years, sometimes thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. Okay, there are two different types of evolution. So we have divergent evolution and we have convergent evolution. So in divergent evolution, the species will evolve towards multiple directions from a common point ancestor, and they would end up looking pretty different. Okay, so they're diverging. A good example is mammals, birds, fishes, reptiles, and amphibians that all come from a common vertebrate ancestor. Yet they've evolved into very different groups of animals. Darwin's finches are another good example of divergent evolution over a shorter period of time. All of these finches shared a common ancestor, yet they evolved to have different beak shapes so that they could adapt to different environmental niches and eat different food. Convergent evolution is the opposite, right? In convergent evolution, we have similar traits that evolve independently in species, and they do not share a common ancestor. But if they face similar selective pressure, they're likely to end up having similar traits. So from various points, but they come together. That's convergent evolution. So divergent, going apart, convergent, coming together. So some examples over here, birds, bats, and insects, right? They all use wings to fly, yet birds and insects don't come from the same ancestors. Just somewhere in evolutionary history, they both face the selective pressure to let the flying individuals survive better to reproduce. Another example is that most animals that live in the Arctic have light color coats because white fur gives them that camouflage protection to be able to blend into those snowy white environments. So the theory of evolution is supported by an overwhelming amount of scientific evidence. It includes fossil evidence, anatomical and embryological evidence, biogeographic evidence, as well as molecular biology evidence. So let's start with fossil evidence. Fossils are preserved remains of formerly living organisms, and fossil records provide pretty solid evidence that organisms from the past are not the same as those today. And it shows a progression of evolution. Scientists today are able to actually determine the age of fossils and categorize them from all over the world to determine when the organisms lived relative to each other. And there's a bunch of different ways that they could do this, right? From carbon dating, isotopes, looking at a bunch of different things to figure out the age. Here's a good example of a fossil record of horses. And as we can see, horses have evolved from a much smaller species with only 4 toes to much larger ones with just 1 toe. Another type of evidence for evolution is the presence of structures in organisms that share the same basic form. So, for example, the bones in a human, dog, bird, and whale appendages basically all share the same overall construction as a result from their common ancestors' appendages. But over time, you can see that evolution led to changes in the bone shapes and sizes in the different species, though they've all kind of maintained the same overall layout. Scientists call these homologous structures. Okay, so some homologous structures are anatomical and they can be observed in fully developed organisms, like the example we just looked at over here. Others might only be seen during embryonic development stages. So, for example, sharks, lizards, chickens, pigs, and humans, right, all present gill slits and a tail at some point during their early development, but the structure disappears in some of the species, right, while it remains in others. So, the presence of what we call vestigial structures, which are non-functional structures, are things that you can find in an organism's body, and they're also anatomical evidence of evolution because they're basically leftovers from evolution. For example, a human tailbone, right? It's not something that we use or necessarily need, but it's something that we have slowly evolved from and we still have it. That's a vestigial structure. And since we mentioned about homologous structures, let's talk about homologies versus analogies. Okay, so homologies or homologous structures are similar structures resulting from divergent evolution. And then analogies or analogous structures, on the other hand, are structures that look very similar, yet they don't come from a common ancestry source. So example, the shape of a dolphin and a shark, again, they look pretty similar, right? But dolphins are mammals, sharks are fishes, And the only reason why they appear to look alike is because they both live in water and they face similar selective pressures from that environment. Therefore, analogies are the products of, again, convergent evolution, where they're coming together. The geographic distribution of organisms on the planet is another example, biogeography, right, of evidence. And if we follow this, we can see patterns that can kind of best explain evolution in conjunction with tectonic plate movement over geological time. So, for broad groups that evolved before the supercontinent Pangea broke up around 200 million years ago, they're distributed pretty worldwide today. So whereas groups that evolved after the breakup, right, after the supercontinent broke up, they appear pretty uniquely in different regions of the planet. So a good example is marsupials in Australia. Marsupials are animals that carry their young in a pouch. They're very diverse in Australia. In fact, most mammal species in Australia are marsupials, which is not common anywhere else in the world. This is suggested to be an early isolation of Australia from the other continents. That's when these marsupials evolved. And in addition to Australia's marsupials, the earlier example we saw about the finches in the Galapagos Island, and even other species of birds, animals, and plants, even in the Hawaiian Islands, right? They're all unique to their one point of origin, yet they display distant relationship to ancestral species on mainland or on different mainlands. It doesn't have to be the US continent. Last type of evidence on our list that we're going to talk about is molecular biology. So for one, all organisms on Earth use DNA as their genetic material. And this really reflects as an evidence that all lives come from a common ancestor who used DNA as its genetic material. So in general, the relatedness of groups of organisms is reflected in the similarity of their DNA sequences. For example, humans and chimps share about 96% of their protein coding gene sequences, while the number drops down to about 85% between humans and mice. Therefore, we know that humans are a lot more closely related to chimpanzees than they are to mice. Okay, so now we've learned about the process of evolution. Let's shift our attention to the outcome of evolution, which is creating more biodiversity and eventually forming new species. So, to know how to define a new species, or to know how to have a new species, we first have to define what a species is. And a species is a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. So, as different as these two dogs over here on the left are, right, they are of the same species. Sometimes individuals from two species could reproduce and give rise to what we call a hybrid individual. So we can see a horse and a donkey mating to produce a mule, right? However, hybrids are usually infertile and won't be able to reproduce. And if you think of it from a chromosome number perspective, it would make sense. For example, the mule is a hybrid produced from the female horse and a male donkey. Horses have 64 chromosomes, donkeys have 62, and mules have 63. This is an odd number that impairs further sexual reproduction. So these guys cannot sexually reproduce, therefore they would not be considered a new species. They would be a hybrid. So now we know what a species is. Let's look at how they're formed. And speciation can describe the formation of two species going into one original species, or two species, sorry, from one original species. And it can be achieved through two different mechanisms. It could be allopatric speciation or sympatric. So allopatric caused by geographic separation, and sympatric is occurring in the same geographical area, and it's usually caused by chromosomal errors or reproductive isolation. So let's focus in a little bit more on allopatric first. Allopatric speciation, again, is caused by geological isolation. So this happens when a group of individuals from the same species would get separated to some sort of isolated geographical area for an extended period of time. And again, an extended period of time isn't like days, years, months. It's like hundreds of years usually. And since the groups are now exposed to different environments, they face different selective pressures that favor different traits. Therefore, each group is going to look more and more different as time goes by until they've changed so much that they can no longer breed with each other, and now we have two different species. The geological isolation in allopatric speciation could happen when natural selection arises and physically divides uh, organisms within a population. So that's what we can see here on the top. So this is known as vicariance. Another situation is if when a few members of a species from a population migrate to a new isolated location to form a new species, and this is called dispersal. And lastly, allopatric speciation could also rise when one original species radiates to form several new species. So a good example of this is like the finches in Darwin's Galapagos Islands. Another great example is actually here in Hawaii. So, you know how earlier I said Hawaii and other islands as well, like Galapagos, other island chains, they tend to have a high level of endemism, which means species that are only found here and nowhere else in the world, but they do have a common ancestor with other species on the continent, right? And this adaptive radiation is part of that. And a great example of that here are the Hawaii honeycreeper birds, as we see here in this figure. Several new species with various beak shapes, again, all originated from the same original species here in the middle, which is the founder species. And we call this adaptive radiation. It's when they're all radiating, adapting away from the same founder species. Another type of speciation is called sympatric speciation. So this happens within the same geological location, and it's not caused by selection pressure, but it's caused by chromosomal errors that arise during cell division. Okay, so sympatric speciation is very common in plants. So I'll just say common in plants. I know I have it written here, but just so you know. In fact, scientists have discovered more than half of all plant species have actually related back to a species evolved through polyploidy. With such a high rate of polyploidy in plants, some scientists hypothesize that this mechanism takes place more as an adaptation rather than an error. And polyploidy is just, having more than two complete sets of chromosomes, right? So it's errors during cell division where you're getting different numbers of chromosomes and you're changing from what your diploid parent was. One of the common outcomes caused by polyploidy is reproductive isolation from the original species. So reproductive isolation could be caused by a number of reproductive barriers that prevent members of a different species from interbreeding. So it could be any of these, right? So let's take a look at these a little bit closer. The first is habitat isolation. And habitat isolation happens when two species occupy different habitats within the same geographic area. So, for example, the two fly species here are found in the same location. However, the apple maggot fly on the left only feeds and mates on apples, while the blueberry maggot fly here on the right only mates and lays eggs on blueberries. So this difference in their choice of habitat would make it so they would never be able to meet and breed with each other. The second reproductive isolation is temporal isolation. So again, they're living in the same geographic location, but it might be during a different time of the day or a season or a year. So for example, the western spotted skunk here on the left, it only mates during late summer, while the eastern spotted skunk here is only mating in late winter. So they don't ever hook up at the same time. Okay, next on the list, behavioral isolation. And this involves different courtship rituals among different species. So, if the courtship ritual of one bird to attract mates is different from the other one, then they're not going to be able to respond to each other or connect with each other. Another reproductive barrier is mechanical isolation. So, this is caused by morphological differences between the two species, and anatomically, they just can't make mating happen. Example, we have here two snails with shell spirals in different directions. So one is moving inward to the center, and then the one of the left spiral counterclockwise, and then the other one has a right spiral clockwise. And as a result, the two snails' genital openings can't actually align with each other, therefore, mating cannot be completed. Okay, last on the list is called gametic isolation. So this occurs when the gametes from two populations cannot fertilize each other. This could happen when the sperm is not able to survive in the reproductive tract of the female of another species, or possibly when the sperm is not equipped with the right enzymes to be able to penetrate the egg's membrane. Regardless of what way this happens, when fertilization cannot be complete, obviously no reproduction can take place. So a great example that we have here for gametic isolation is sea urchins of different species that live in the same area. Many of them mate during the same time by releasing their gametes into the water in a process called spawning. Right? But with so many sperm and eggs that are all swimming in the same water, only the ones from the same species can actually fertilize each other due to this gametic isolation between the two species. Reproductive barriers can sometimes be breached when two members of different species do manage to mate and then reproduce a hybrid. However, most hybrids do display reduced viability, and all of them are sterile due to their abnormal number of chromosomes in their body. So they are basically unfit and they will not be able to reproduce themselves.